Okay, let's look at a couple of the attributes and properties I'm addressing as I go through the painting. First, I want to go over the anatomy of light, as I'm calling it. There seems to be 100 different terms for this set of parts in rendering. None of them necessarily consistent. Uh, any preliminary art course that you'll take or any art book that you'd look at has some variation of this, and I'm going to cover it very briefly. Though I would recommend the Sam Nielsen Schoolism courses on light, the Gnomon Workshop, Scott Robertson rendering course, as well as Scott Robertson's book Rendering, the Andrew Loomis books. There are this setup of a sphere with the properties of light and shadow. There you can find all kinds of online sources and written work on what exactly they are. So I'm going to cover it very briefly and describe how I'm addressing each of these things as I'm working on the magician painting. So, the first part would be when you have a light source. We'll set that there. As the light casts down, the part that is most perpendicular to the light cast will receive the most light. Everything falling off from there, and in this case down to here, loses a percentage of light. The light actually will go from straight to falling off, and decaying until there is a parallel direction to the light rays. That's when you'll come to the terminator, or the terminus of the light, which is right here. This is where the light rays no longer directly shine. The percentage of light rays is sometimes called light decay or light fall off, and that's the loss of the percentage of photons basically touching the surface of the object. So this is the fall off of the light. Light itself also has a decay, and it's a quadratic decay. And what that means is that while the light is casting, let's put a couple of objects here for space. What's happening is this will get a predominance of rays, but as these rays cast out, this loses a certain percentage, and then this loses a certain percentage, and the further away from the light source you get, you lose strength and light. So two things are happening. Depending on the distance from the light, there's light decay, and the light actually will be hitting the surface incompletely in off angles. Scott Robertson, his course, has the very clear and great phrase, form change equals value change. So what this describes is, as an object is changing form, the value, the percentage of from 100 to 0, let's say, over this arc, the value of this light changes, and as an object changes its form, the light will be hitting it at different angles, so it will be form change equaling value change. It's an indicator that your eyes easily read. Now, I'm going to use, I've vandalized this fairly well, I'm going to show what each of these pieces are. So the first here is the strongest light where it's perpendicular to the light source and the object is absorbing most of the light. This is the terminus, the end part of the part that's parallel to the light rays that are reflected here. On the back side of this terminus, or the terminator, is the core shadow. That means that basically everything that's falling behind where the light has ceased to cast. This is ambient light, or indirect lighting, the light that's bounced from surrounding objects in the environment. This is also bounced light, light bounced from the material beneath the object. cast shadow is, of course, the hole punched out by this object blocking light onto a surface. It will be stronger closest to the surface, its line, depending on the type of light. The line itself will be stronger and then will become more diffuse. At the base here is contact shadow or ambient occlusion, where light is closed out, where two intersecting surfaces meet. And of course this is the light fall off. This is a specular highlight or an active highlight as opposed to the passive highlight. That means if you rotate this ball, this will move because it's actually a reflection of the light. Now, I've done this incorrectly, and I've done it incorrectly for a couple of reasons. One is to show that where your passive highlight and where your active highlight sit are not matching. It's offset. Unless you were wearing a miner's cap and were looking directly down on this object, light being cast here, your miner's cap specular highlight would be about there. Your specular highlight is just a reflection of the light itself. Now, there are laws of reflectance, and I've moved this over to just give an example that this and this don't necessarily sit together. In fact, don't usually sit together. I've also put it there to show that in art we have some fudging room. And the room where we can fudge information, where we can put inaccuracies that read as true, is going to make up a great deal of what we do. It allows us to step into the hyperreal and trick the eye into accepting things that don't fit into a physical reality but are acceptable to understand: shapes, forms, time, even at certain points with perspective and foveal saccades, how our eyes flick and take in saturation and emphasis. There's all kinds of tricks that we can do with that. And I wanted to give a brief example with this when I made these, that these things can be fudged, but this isn't at the right location for the angle of this light, should anyone have noticed that. What I'm going to do, and I've done a couple of other spheres just to give some ideas of how these things work with color and different light types, subsurface scattered, light translucent material, some stronger reflection as opposed to just a specular highlight and gloss. It's kind of a weak reflection. So I wanted to show a couple of examples of those and suggest that taking a sphere, or drawing a ball, and working through each of these principles, the passive highlight, the light fall off, the terminus or terminator, the cast shadow, how light is bouncing in from other areas, which is the ambient light, the ambient occlusion, where light gets cut out. I think I mentioned the cast shadow. Working with these things and accounting for each piece is a large part of what I'm doing right now at this point in the process of this painting. I'm going to work on this digitally very quickly to show what I mean on one of the earlier iterations of the painting itself. So I'll close these out real quick. And I also wanted to address one other thing. Last week I had mentioned when I was going over why I'm using oils and the advantages of oils, I mentioned the refractivity of the medium. These are examples of water. This would be the refractive nature of water. All of these are the same object rendered in 3D with different refractive indices. So this is how water distorts and gives a sense of depth. This is with no sense of depth. This is with, I think I had an absolute minimum of refractivity. So water will refract and lens light to this extent. Oil paint, when freshly put on, is a refractive index of 1.48, which is very deep. and gives, these are all the same thickness, they're all the same object with different materials put on. This gives a deep sense. But after 10 years, oil paints, linseed oil, seasons, and it actually hits a refractive index of 1.58, which is the same refractive index as crown glass. So its depth gets even stronger, and you can see the distortion and the deepness that this allows. This is one of the advantages of oil paints, is that the pigments are suspended in that linseed oil medium, and light is bending through it. It gives real depth that allows us to manipulate this deepness and this bending with different thicknesses. The more pigment in the medium, the more light is blocked and can't quite bend as much, so we can actually control distance. So I wanted to give an example of that instead of just casually mentioning it. With the parts of light, I want to give a brief warning about some good and bad things to watch as I'm painting, and regarding the account and the anatomy of light. I may work on him a little bit too, a little less cluttered piece to show how I'm using the paint to imitate light parts. But the warning I wanted to give is you have to be careful watching somebody paint. It's good in the regard that when you see someone do something, when you understand that someone is able to build a thing and can make something, and you see their hand do it, you are projecting onto them. You have mirror neurons, and I'll cover that at a later point, that allows you to project your body and actions of others in a certain sense, and understand what they're doing and prepare your own body to do it. It allows you to sympathize with, to bodily sympathize, so that you can understand what's going on. It's a major part in any action we take, visual things like art included. But there are certain things I'm doing that might not be sensible, and being that they're not sensible, at least nothing I've given any category or information for, like the direction of my paint strokes and why I'm doing certain lines and whatnot, that might throw you off. So I would recommend not considering what I'm doing like recipes, like if you do a line in such a way, you will get such a result. I'm using lines and other indicators to act as pareidolia, or things to trigger my own brain to build patterns and organize. So it's good to see someone paint and understand that this is not an impossible task, and this can flow easily. But also you have to be careful not to expect too much out of what you're seeing. That what I'm doing is trying to find affordances, using my tools to try to manipulate more opportunities in the work. I'm not necessarily going through set tasks that come up with set results. A couple of things I wanted to mention is with the categorical information. What I mean by watching my brush strokes and being careful. Let me show an example of what I mean. That'll work fine. Let's do this. Now I'm going to draw a figure that you've probably seen before. And we'll do this with it, maybe stylize it a little bit. Now, you've seen this before. Some of you are right away able to recognize what this is, but some of you are thinking you haven't seen this before. You may be associating it with some type of alphabet or symbol. And that would be somewhat correct, but the symbol is just the number 13. Um, when I say that watching me paint a stroke has some categorical problems, um, you may be looking for one thing, but I'm actually doing something else. So though I had this symmetrically placed and went through a certain number of steps and started in the middle, all of these things have cascading events that lead to categorical expectations, not necessarily to the 13, which is what I was making. That will happen quite a bit. So again, categories, which is something that I'll cover at a later point and we'll be manipulating quite a bit. There are many things going on that build a drawing and signal brains enough to confabulate them to match a reality. There's many things involving manipulating categorical things. But while I'm painting and going through this, it wouldn't be ideal to have that as one of them as you're observing. I'll save that. It wasn't that good. Can't believe it was that scratchy. I swear I do this as a professional. Okay, another thing I wanted to go over, and that's why I brought this in. One, because it's close to Christmas and I can do what I want. Is I want to show some properties of lines and go over those very quickly. Lines, when we start with pencils, when we do a drawing, there's a reason we use line, and line is one of the beginning principles of how we see it all. We use line, even though it's a completely inaccurate tool, because our brains are trying to find, using curves, edges, and corners, a great deal of information, from boundaries and silhouettes to motion, and a lot of this will go into the order and hierarchy by which our brains understand vision, how we build the experience of vision, which isn't just using our eyes. Our tactile senses and sound also play a part in that. I'll address that and some of the stranger aspects of drawing sound and drawing gender and drawing inanimate signals of gender when I cover some line work with the Kiki Bobo experiment. And I know that phrase sounds ridiculous, but work with me. Another thing I wanted to cover is that when we're doing these drawings, the end point is not, absolutely not, the end point, the goal. The purpose of this is not to create an emotional response. Emotions for an artist are not the goal. They're a diagnostic tool. As we're working, we are creating many pre-conscious cues. We're building vision for the brain. We are taking control and hijacking, and there's a lot of criminal terms that I'll be using to describe this, but I can't really find any term that's pleasing and nice sounding to describe what's going on. We are hijacking, we are commandeering how your brain interprets sight. We're manipulating parts of it in ways that your brain won't normally do. In a lot of ways, we share a lot in common with magicians. We are preparing things for your brain to accept and confabulate information. Hitting emotions is just the part where it becomes conscious. It isn't the goal. It's just saying, we've hit enough thresholds, we've passed enough gates, that now we have hit the point where the audience is aware something is happening. There is so much more that we're doing that they aren't aware of, that at a certain point in these courses, I am planning and preparing an ethics segment, because it's important. Art is not a passive small thing. It's mind writing. Instead of mind reading, it's mind writing, and its potentials are disturbing in a number of senses, from writing people's sense of hierarchy, their heights and positions, their memories can be overwritten and changed. It's impressive and dramatic, but also may need some consideration as to what exactly we're doing. So as I'm going through this, I am doing things with the painting and with the drawings to, um, in some ways, have emotion work. But that's just the start. What happens after emotions, the things that people aren't aware of, the cues and the distortions in time and the number of things that go into a picture and people aren't aware of, way outnumber emotionality. The other problem with emotion is, and using that as the end goal, which I understand is used quite a bit in more romantic descriptions and sort of the marketing of art, the mystical marketing of art, is that people don't even care about emotions themselves. It seems odd to consider that artists would spend lifetimes working on this, assembling these things, and I hope to show the extravagant amount of information wrapped up in these things to appeal to people's emotions, which people have hundreds, if not thousands, of emotional responses every day, very few that they even remember. That we would spend time trying to trigger something that they don't remember very much, that they don't put great value in, seems a little ridiculous. Emotions are a good part of what are a good part, is a beneficial part or an interesting part of what we're doing with art, but it is not the goal. It's not the purpose. There's so much more going on. Art is actually one of our evolutionary survival tools. It's written into the human animal. This is not an indulgence. It's not cute. It's in some respects dangerous. And those are parts that I'll hopefully be covering in a segment on the history of art and what art is. Anyway, I think that should cover it for a good deal of this. Let me give a brief demonstration and talk a bit less and show how I'm using what I'm calling the anatomy of light, and how I'm trying to make my paint or whatever tool I happen to be using imitate the principles and attributes of light. So I'm going to start with white on this black and white background, this value setup, and we'll pretend again that the light is coming from here. And I'm going to just do a pass of trying to find the perpendicular areas. The perpendicular areas, or most perpendicular areas, and then indicate their shape by altering the light fall off. So like here, that's a perpendicular area. And here, I don't stay consistent and work with one attribute at a time. I jump back and forth. So for example, if I see a high area here of passive highlight dropping down, I may actually also throw in the active highlight while I'm at it. Again, I'm not going to be covering in any great detail the how-to of drawing as such. There are parts of this, for example, learning about value and how to build your visual acuity to understand subtle gradations. using value scales, which is a very common exercise. Um, I'm not going to be showing things like that. Again, I think those can be found all over the place, and there are many good artists who go into great detail about them. I have some different ideas on how to approach that entirely, um, but the underlying principle is sound, that in order to draw, it isn't just a matter of understanding that there's value scales going on. People are generally blind to a good deal of the detail going on around them. They not only have attention blindness, but their brains haven't had a need to develop the acuity to discern subtle differences. Um, a way to handle that is to draw value scales, and if you don't know what that is, I'll draw one real quick over in the corner here. That's taking one of these guys, and it is super tedious, and going from darkest to lightest and building your hand so that you can go as light as you'd like. Um, it's important to have this skill. By looking at it while you're doing it, your brain is building it. But your hand is also training in conjunction with your eye. They're working together. Your somatosensory system and your visual system are very closely tied. They overlap. And the subtleties in your hand will also be read as new subtleties and new gradations of discernment in your eyes. So it's not just, it is a good exercise. It's a good thing to do and a good thing to exercise, to do. But I don't necessarily think that doing it on a scale like this is ideal. As much as those things, your somatosensory system, how your hands are working, and as these things tie together, they do reinforce, but environmentally, like drawing faces and understanding that you should keep an eye out for this and try to do gradations, and keep an eye out for very subtle things and try to get as subtle as you can as you're drawing. That is also another way to do it, and it reinforces still other tools. It ties the subtlety of your touch, the subtlety of your distinct value distinction into other systems entirely. So the isolation, I don't necessarily think is the best way to go about learning something. We don't actually learn in isolation. We have many parts and pieces that we deal with, and those parts and pieces tie together. Art is very cohesive in terms of imitating environment, and I don't know that separating things out is the most ideal way of doing it. You can learn through this way, and it's good to throw in this exercise, but I wonder at it being a good deal of ritual and superstition to have this exercise coming from the olden days to the present as the standard. So anyway, I said I wasn't going to talk as much, sorry. Again, I'm just using I'm just taking white, and I actually do this quite a bit with the paint as well. I'm just trying to find perpendicular or near perpendicular areas to indicate the passive highlight or strongest area of light absorption, however you want to term it. There should be at some point some type of art summit where artists get together and find a conventional language for what we're talking about, because it's incredibly confusing. Going over the books in preparation for this and looking at art courses, where closely aligned with physics, there is starting to show a standard language, but not entirely. There's still art language referring to things that are known in 3D and digital things based in physics they just don't have a common language. And and the conventional language would be incredibly helpful in trying to suss out what parts and what we're dealing with teaching. Okay, let me show. That's been the direct light, and we can see some areas, but I'm going to go through and do a quick ambient occlusion pass, or creases, where the light gets squeezed out, basically. I'm using an overly strong value scale here to indicate that, but that's fine. Gonna get into lost edges with this part here, just because I'm trying to show some of the value of creases, which is our curve line and corner detection. Okay, and to do a cast shadow. Strengthen that. You see me draw this, you'll usually see me try to indicate and mark out the terminator or terminus. Just the part where the light ceases. Okay, and a little bounce light. And some bounce light coming in from underneath. Oh, that's too strong. Well, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's terrible, but you get the idea. Well, that's unacceptable. Okay, I can't live with that. Making those errors reminds me of another point I wanted to address, which is how to go about training and learning and considering art. There is often there's discussion of becoming disciplined and learning the ways to push past some of the tedium. A lot of that, and art has its tedious moments, and art training does as well. But training shouldn't actually be removed from trying to see something. That's the main endeavor. And following your interest will take you much further than considering things as a dedicated course to become something, to become an artist, let's say. Don't try to become an artist. Try to see something and follow your interest. If while doing a drawing you're getting bored, put everything down and come back to it later. A couple of good reasons for that are, if you work through and try to discipline yourself like it's a task and a procedure, something unpleasant, you'll remember it as that, and it'll become associated with it. It'll attach to the experience that drawing is not interesting, it's horrible, it's tedious, and so on. That is not ideal. What is ideal is to understand that you're going to make every mistake possible, and that's good. It's good to explore those. You're going to do thousands of pictures that if you don't finish a picture, it's not the end of the world. Even if you're looking to do art as a career, first understand what you're trying to do is see something, not become an artist, not make art. You want to see something, and as you build what you want to see, you'll want it to flesh out and become more and more convincing, more and more a reality, an experience, as opposed to um, a cultural, social standard of what's described as art. If you follow it along those lines, if you follow it along an interest, and you'll do it when you have the drive to do it, and as you're making progress, and patiently with the understanding that the long haul is actually what you're on, because you won't finish any training, any learning with this. It's in your life. It's too broad and strange, and there's just too much to it. You're you're handing the baton on to the next generation. So I'm not saying relax necessarily, but I'm saying enjoy it as far as possible and follow your interest in it and the drive of your interest, not necessarily follow a ritualistic paramilitary sense of of suffering that goes along with do these many exercises a day. You'll probably learn things doing that, but I'm not sure you'll learn any faster or better than you would by just paying attention and considering it leisure and with a great deal of pleasure in the subject. So, all right, I think you get the idea with this black and white study. I'm gonna turn over and work a bit more on the actual painting now, and I hope this was helpful. Thanks.